Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. This is take 2 of an episode that we attempted earlier this week, but due to technical difficulties, will never see the light of day. I am joined once again by Sam Sikdar and Aleks, the Hebrew Hammer Salkin.
Wow, it's an illustrious title.
A.K.A. Robitus and Aleks.
Just waiting for it.
Don't worry, we'll give you a chance to get your retort in. Now, so we're gonna have a fun wheeling discussion here on the intersection between science and religion, or faith and reason, or however you want to talk about it. And we went on pretty good last time for about an hour. Thought it was a good conversation. Shame it's gone. So,
it was really good.
Yeah, it was good.
Sometimes it's hard to recreate it.
Yeah, well,
So, unless you got Canadian Mist.
It is a lazy Friday.
Sam's got the whiskey.
The only person.
Hold on, Aleks. Let me get you the mic, because you're going to start this episode off anyways, because the whole conversation was kicked off from you last time. So just give my voice a break here for a minute.
You got it. By the way, I have to come up with some sort of an insulting nickname for you now that you've gotten this one for me. In the last episode, the one that will never see the light of day, I was allowed to describe the origins of Robitus and Aleks, the unjust origins of it, all right? Because it's not like... Oh, here's what happened. So this is back in like January. It was me, Pat, and his other friend, Pat. And we were all standing around. I guess, it's like cold and flu season, so we're talking about people drinking Robitussin, not to cure some sort of a very harsh cold or flu, but rather to get high. I was not speaking from personal experience, but I did mention that I had a friend in high school who made it a point to do that. And imagine he has not gotten a cold since, because the amount of Robitussin that he drank was prodigious.
When we were in high school, kids used to call it robo-tripping.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, and, funny enough, Pat, Mr., Robo Aleks, LOL, well, he's over there hacking his lungs out. I feel pretty good.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
So anyway, the way the whole conversation started off last time is, I don't remember what started it, but I remember a friend of mine recounting a story to me of a certain, let's say, scientist who was very popular in the kettlebell community. I won't use his full name. I'll just use the last initial of his last name. So we'll say Kenneth J. Was asked about his religious beliefs, and he said something to the effect of, like, I don't have any religious beliefs. I'm a scientist. Like, I don't have any religious beliefs. I'm a scientist. Or something along these lines. It was something equally dumb, yeah, and snide, to use other words. And I remember just thinking, like, even though, like, at the time when I heard it, I'm like, well, that, like, those things have nothing to do with one another. To me, that seems like a very obvious observation, that being a scientist does not inherently negate having religious beliefs. And the conversation was struck from there, and a good conversation was had by all. So,
Shame you missed it.
Yeah, a real shame you guys missed it. But Pat and Sam are going to help recreate this a little bit, and hopefully Pat's germs are not going to infect all of us. Sam probably the least, because he's hitting that Canadian sauce. So I'm guessing he's going to be immune, or at least killing the germs as they come in. Pat, on the other hand, see, it's already hitting me. I just coughed right there.
You guys are weak. You guys are weak.
Thank you, Aleks, for bringing us back to where we left off. So we've got 3 religions in the room. We've got Hindu, we've got Catholic, we've got Jew. So we're gonna navigate this territory, and I want to start the same way we did last time. Sam, as he corrected me before, was a real scientist. He's not designing microchips anymore. But the question I asked you last time, and I'd like you to see if you can be consistent with your answer. You had a very religious upbringing. and you come from a very scientific family and have, of course, formal scientific training yourself. Was there ever a point, as you were moving through the education process, that you thought that there was some learning scientifically about the world and your religious beliefs?
No.
That's exactly the response he gave last time. And then we just cut the episode there.
And that was it.
Please unpack that.
I'm
for us.
nothing if not consistent.
This is true. Yes, we can always give Sam that.
We were joking around with somebody. I think it was with Chris. How you and I have been doing the same workout for the last 10 years.
It's true. Double clean and press, front squat, pull up.
Yeah. So my mom has a PhD in mathematics. Mm-hmm. My dad has a PhD in electronics. My sister, who I guess is the only non-scientist in the family, has multiple doctorates in law. Mm-hmm. So I don't know where that fits in. And my other sister, who's also not a practicing scientist, but also has multiple certifications or board whatevers in the medical field. So I'm actually the least educated of the lot.
Go figure.
But least schooled, I guess, at least. But, the way we were brought up, and I never would have said as a child and then as an adolescent that, like, I belonged to a very religious household. Mm-hmm. It was just normal, right? Mm-hmm. Where, I think part of what we were talking about is how in Hindu and Indian culture, the religion and everyday life is completely intertwined. Mm-hmm. Whereas now, as I've been sort of more than in America, but it seems like in America too, is there's this sort of quarantining of religion from the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. So for us, because that sort of segregation doesn't occur, there was never any conflict. Like, of course you're going to learn as much science and math, hard science, as we say.
Real science.
Real science. The real stuff. As possible. Mm-hmm. In fact, regardless of what you want to do with your life. Mm. And then, religion and faith was just part and parcel of that. Mm-hmm. There was no conflict. And that was really my question last episode, and it is on this episode as well, is what is the actual conflict? Where does it come from? And why do people have difficulty reconciling to have a religious practice? And why do people have difficulty reconciling to have a religious practice and still, use science to describe what we can of the world in some way?
Yeah, so I've had some time to think on this a little bit more since the last episode, which was just totally spontaneous. So maybe this one will be even a little bit more productive. Because I think Sam phrased last time, what is your problem?
Right.
What is your guys' problem? What is specifically the problem? Because this was never a problem for me.
That's right.
Or this or that. The more I thought about it, I think it comes down to a couple of different problems, there is a technical term for it. It's called the conflict hypothesis that's been thrown out there, and it kind of comes in degrees. Some people will be like, okay, what we know about the world scientifically makes competing truth claims with certain particular religious claims. And I think we can think of some examples of that, which we talked about last time. And I think we can think of some examples of that, which we talked about last time and can get into in this episode. And most of them, as we discovered last time, come down to what both Aleks and I believe are inappropriate interpretations of the Bible. Almost all of these cases come down to that. Now, obviously, people who interpret the Bible that way will say that it's the right, but that's a theological issue and a scriptural issue. But let's bracket that, because I think
you could make the same argument, I guess, in Hinduism, where we have these stories from our scripture that are not to be taken literally.
Yes, and I don't know enough about. I don't want to be like, well, Hinduism is this because I just don't know enough.
Yeah.
But in the way that Catholics look at the Bible, and it was, of course, the Catholic Church that assembled it, the New Testament, anyways.
Yep.
And that's a big reason I became. But one of it was I would go to one kind of church, and then I'd go to another kind of church, and they'd have completely different interpretations. So I'm like, there seems like there has to be some type of authority here, like something over and above this. Again, another discussion. But the Bible is really a collection of books that spans a lot of different genre and literary styles. And when you have that proper understanding and nuance, then I think whatever conflict hypothesis there is, it almost immediately explodes. And we can come back to that. And I want to make sure Aleks gets to talk on that again too. But there's even more fundamental issue, and it's a philosophical assumption that people take, and it's this sort of idea of empiricism, which can be traced back to a couple different thinkers like David Hume, but has become increasingly annoying, I would say, among a lot of the sort of new atheist types, and it kind of goes under the label of scientism now. And the idea is that the scientific form of knowledge is the only way of knowing something. So obviously, anything that smacks of the supernatural, that might suggest that comes in the form of religion or philosophy. It's not just religion, but philosophy or whatever. If it cannot be discovered or tested through the scientific process, then we just can't know anything about it, or therefore it doesn't exist, right, is the kind of strongest form of scientism. So you shouldn't believe anything that can't be verified through the scientific method. And this is a very pernicious philosophy. First off, it's really stupid. And the reason it's stupid is the scientific form of knowing cannot be the only form of knowing, because it presupposes other logic. It presupposes logic. It certainly can't tell you anything about ethics, can't tell you anything about beauty, and it can't even meet its own standard. So to say that you should only believe things that can be empirically verified is not itself a statement that can be empirically verified. So but people believe this, and they believe it because, and I hate to go into the pseudoscience of psychoanalysis. I think it kind of gives them, it allows them to put on a certain false sense of confidence. I'm a scientist, right? I'm a scientist, and I only believe things that you can prove to me scientifically. And it's this weird socio-cultural thing. When you examine it philosophically, it's absurd for the reasons that we just talked about. Obviously, there are other ways of knowing that have to be valid if you even want to get the scientific method off the ground.
But it's attaching this, like you said, like, let's not do too much psychoanalysis, but we'll do a little.
Yeah.
Too much psychoanalysis, but we'll do a little.
Yeah,
if
they can do pseudoscience, so can we.
So can we. But this emotional attachment to being a scientist. So it's not that you have an absence of religion. Mm-hmm. You've just replaced religion with something else that we wouldn't, colloquially call a religion. But this idea is like, the whole point of science is it's not necessarily proven. We just have either enough evidence or enough consensus that there's extremely high likelihood, right? Mm-hmm. So, we hear this phrase a lot, like the science is settled.
Which it can't be science.
It contradicts to what science is, right?
Yeah.
Science really is just a methodology of asking more questions.
Yeah, it's inductive probability gathering.
Yes.
Is what science is.
Yes.
So to ever say that the science is settled is just a what science is. Yes. So to ever say that the science is settled is just a category mistake.
Right.
It doesn't. It's a great political talking point. But it totally confuses what the scientific method is. It's always inductive. It's not deductive. It's always inductive. It's always gathering data points, evidence, and it can give us probabilities, and very strong probabilities, it seems, but not certainty. And you need other forms of knowing that, again, the sciences presuppose if you want to have certainty in things. But your point is a good one, and I think it's valid, is it allows people to kind of put on a fake sense of confidence Which is very funny because the accusation is usually, oh, people have faith. That's just pretending to believe in something you know isn't true, which is a horribly crude straw man. But like, look how you're acting. You're acting in the very manner of the thing that you were attempting to criticize. That was the new insight I brought to this conversation. Is it actually, a lot of it stems out of this very crude philosophy, which itself is just kind of a rehashing of a philosophy known of logical positivism that totally collapsed, but now it's sort of back again in an even dumber form, and it'll collapse again because it's philosophically unsustainable for the reasons that we just went through. It's just stupid. But that was the new thing I wanted to bring to the discussion today, and that is by the way, that is nothing. Scientism. To be against scientism isn't to be against science, right? They're totally, I want to make it clear, they're totally unrelated. Scientism is a bad philosophy. The method of science is a fantastic enterprise for learning things.
That's right. And that's the other thing is, like, science isn't something that you should be for or against. It's not really something, it's not be a political thing that you take a stance on, right? So it's like one of those things, one of my pet peeves was this idea of people used to say, like, that's a failed experiment when they didn't get the result they wanted, right? So it's like, hey, I have hypothesis A, I ran the experiment, and instead of result A, I got 1 minus A, right? Yeah. The inverse, hypothetically. So people say, oh, that's a failed experiment. No, you fundamentally misunderstand the point of experimentation, right? It's only a failed experiment if the experiment didn't yield a useful result at all, not if the result didn't agree with you. So it's like people have gone so far into this idea. It's like, well, science is just a tool for me to prove my existing bias. Otherwise, it's a failure. No, that's not what it's supposed to be at all. Like we said, it's a methodology of answering questions and failure. No, that's not what it's supposed to be at all. Like we said, it's a methodology of answering questions and yielding data, right? What you do with that data and the conclusions you draw from it, some of which may be scientific, but then you get into that weird, like, what ought we do? And that's a whole different field.
Again, science has nothing to say about ethics. It can't.
Nor should it, and we should stop asking it to.
We've tried no short number of times, and it's always been a disaster.
Yeah.
It's always been a disaster. Aleks, did you have something you want to chime in on this part?
I think you guys are covering this pretty well. I mean, the big thing I think for people to glean from this is that you don't want to number one, you don't want to let your biases show through when what you're trying to do is get to some sort of truth, because the truth is going to be whatever it is. It's not really
question on terms.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a distinction without a difference. Would you say there's a difference between truth and knowledge?
Yeah, to me, that seems like I don't think that I could verbalize exactly. Well, Pat could probably do a better job verbalizing like the difference, but to me the two seem like they're very distinct. Pat, why don't you?
So this is obviously a classic philosophical question. Knowledge, we would a general definition that I would agree with is knowledge is justified true belief. That's what knowledge would be. So whereas truth is a state of I have a true belief if what I believe actually maps onto reality. That would be a rough definition of the correspondence theory of truth. Right, that my belief corresponds to the way the world actually is. That's a true belief. A justified. Now, I can hold a true belief without knowing why it's true. So a justified. Now, I can hold a true belief without knowing why it's true. So that would not constitute knowledge in the philosophical sense, where a justified true belief would be. So there is a difference. A lot of people think that they're the same, but knowledge, we would say, is justified true belief. Whereas, maybe I just was come up with a belief. I was born into a culture. I hold it. I think it's true, but I couldn't give you an argument for it. I don't know why it's true.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean it isn't true.
Right.
Whereas knowledge is, okay, I argued my way through. I have reasons. I have evidence. I believe that I have warrant for this belief, and that would be justified true belief. Is that satisfying to some?
It is. I like that.
Yeah. No, it's an important thing because there's a different, and same thing is knowledge the same as certainty is no. You don't have to be certain to have knowledge either. And these are do an episode on any one of these by itself, but they are important topics because you can also have defeaters for beliefs, right? You had a certain degree of knowledge at and this is a good example of science. You had a certain degree of knowledge for a long time that every swan was white, based off of the probabilities that every swan that you observed was white. Then you go to Australia or whatever, you find one black swan.
Right.
You now have a defeater of that belief.
Correct.
Unless you can provide a defeater of the defeater, saying, "Oh, somebody spray painted that swan" or something like that, right? So,
or it's not actually a swan.
Or it's not a swan or something. So these would all be like deep epistemological questions, but important to explore, and it's hard not to get into them when considering this. All right, so back to the science. The thing we talked about last time that I think is important, and I actually got to talk to a priest the other day who went to MIT for mathematics, and we jammed on this.
So he clearly didn't see it.
I'm like, look, man, it's bad news for you if there's really a conflict between science and. He's like, it's the most ridiculous thing. And he called it for what it is. It's a very popular mainstream talking point that stirs up a ton of controversy, makes for great headlines. He's like, some of the best scientists in the world today, and pretty much all of them in their past, were devout religious believers, theists. Science emerged out of a religious culture. I mean, think of some of the best scientists. I mean, Gregor Mendel. He was he an Augustinian monk? He was some type of monk, right? The father of genetic science. You have Father Georges Lemaitre, who is literally the father of modern cosmology. He was the father of the Big Bang Theory, right? Francis Collins, the Human Genome Project. Like, you just go through it. And I had Stephen Barr on the podcast. PhD from, I think it was Yale or Princeton, theoretical physicist. It's just like when you actually get PhD from, I think it was Yale or Princeton, theoretical physicist. It's just like when you actually get serious about this, when you get past the headlines and the talking points. So he called it out on this, but the point I was talking to him about was the same thing with you, is like thinking even just about mathematics is really interesting. Like, why is it that we should have this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, this uncanny applicability of mathematics to the physical world? Now, I suggested that in a theistic worldview, this actually makes a lot of sense. In a world that is ordered by God, it's not a big surprise that things would have this not just complex but utterly elegant structure. But if you're a naturalist, which is like the strongest form of atheism, there's really no explanation for this. You just have to think that it's a happy coincidence. So if you don't think that it is a happy coincidence that we have this uncanny applicability of mathematics, it's one of those things that so many people just take for granted, or don't probe on a deeper level. Same thing with like laws of nature. What is a law of nature? What is it?
Like an example would be gravity.
Yeah.
Gravity is a law of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might argue something like the Pareto principle is a law of nature.
Yeah. So,
but these are things that, how do I say this without being circular? Because it's like, right?
This is the problem scientists face.
Yeah.
And when you go back to the people who formulated Newton and Descartes, what they said were laws of nature were decrees of God. They were just theological.
Yeah.
Now, I would say that that's somewhat unsatisfying, and I would kind of fall more into an Aristotelian Thomistic interpretation of it. But it's important to say, like, nobody has actually gotten around that definition, really. Later scientists would be like, oh, it's just a metaphor. But then they fall into this, like, when you really probe, like, what is the law of nature? People just don't really think it. Like, why is it that we should see these immutable and sort of unchanging characteristic qualities of the world we live in? Why? What is that? What breathes fire into them? As even Stephen Hawking said in one of his original books. Like,
wow. What
breathes fire into these laws of nature? Back when he was still thinking somewhat straight and stopped trying to be such a pop scientist. And that was something Stephen Barr brought up. He's like, yeah, like all scientists, when they think deeply on this, just really, unless you're willing to go beyond science, just landed at a gigantic question mark. A gigantic question mark. Now, again, in a theistic worldview, it's not a problem. We still are like curious, okay, like what model best explain this? Is it occasionalism, as some people would say, or is it kind of like an Aristotelian, formal, substantial? And those are all interesting details, but the general fit is very nice in a theistic worldview. In a naturalistic worldview, it's just the most you can kind of say is just kind of a happy coincidence. And that not only seems utterly unsatisfying, but it really makes it seem like the world is not intelligible. But we all assume that the world is intelligible. In fact, when we look for answers, we tend to find them.
Right.
I forget what you said about even just mathematics last time, but
I'm trying to remember.
It's just one of those things that's worth thinking about that not a whole lot of people do. So I guess my general.
Well, I think what I was saying about math last time is like math is the most abstract thing, right? It can, you can have these from tiny to giant, elegant formulas and equations and variables, and you can have entire equations without a single number in them. Like at least numbers, because we agree, much like language, like okay, this symbol represents this object or this sound or this quantity, can be taken out of the abstract. But the full realm of mathematics is very, very abstract, right? X's and Y's and alphas and gammas and imaginary numbers and all of this, right?
Because I did learn imaginary numbers. They're useful for engineers for electrical circuits, right? Is that?
Yeah, we need them.
Yeah,
we need them.
Because I was always trying to think like, what the heck am I studying this stuff for? Anyways,
yeah, you need them for circuits and more specifically like defining signals.
Yeah.
But that's sort of what I'm getting at, right? So it's like any signal, analog signal, can be described with what we call a Fourier transform. So it's calculus, basically, right? And you get what we would call a waveform to describe this signal in nature. So, but it goes both ways, So like all of these mathematical concepts, you find them in nature, right? Yeah. Whether they're sinusoids, whether they're light waves, particle waves, all of these things. But then you can go back and describe them. I mean, some of these equations are not simple. Don't get me wrong, but they can all be described with mathematics.
Yes,
and that I think is sort of the essence of what we're talking about, right? And then we see these things like, okay, let's come up with this formula, and then we see it appear in nature on all sorts of animals, geological formations,
differential equations and springs, right?
Yep. Yes, exactly.
I'm remembering.
Yeah, like it's everywhere. It's everywhere. So it's as somebody that likes to nerd out on this stuff, it's pretty cool.
It's really cool, and some of the oldest mathematicians would just call it what it is. Studying the mind of God.
Sure.
Now. Again, there's many different interpretations of how we can look at laws of nature and what it is, studying the mind of God.
Sure.
Now, again, there's many different interpretations of how we can look at laws of nature and this and that, even within a theistic worldview of what exactly is a law of nature. But in a general sense, it fits very well. Where it actually doesn't fit well or doesn't seem to make a lot of sense unless you're just willing to posit brute unintelligibility on some level. And again, deeply unsatisfying there. Now, the other thing I was what the heck? It was just in my mind, and now it's just shot out. So we were talking about the uncanny applicability of mathematics. Oh, the general. Okay, so the general, I guess, way I would talk about this. There's a really good book by Alvin Plantinga, philosopher Alvin Plantinga, called "Where the Conflict Really Lies." Highly recommend this book. And his thesis, I absolutely agree with. He says, where there may seem to be a superficial conflict or tension between there is, in fact, irreconcilable difficulty and conflict. And he unpacks this in this wonderful volume. But I think if anybody really wants to hear it from an atheist, I think a good person to pick up would be like Aleks Rosenberg. He's a contemporary atheist, and I like him because, and he wrote the book An Atheist Guide to Reality. Anybody can pick it up because he's somebody who can start from the premise of metaphysical naturalism, and he's like a strong form scientism guy too. Like he advocates for that thing we were just ridiculing, but I'll give him credit on this. He starts from the position of metaphysical naturalism, that only things exist, and he's willing to go all the way to the conclusions, beautifully, consistently, unlike so many of the new atheists today. So what does he do? He says that, well, if only physical things exist, there's really no such thing as meaning. There's really no such thing as truth. Ironically, even says all the sentences in his book have no meaning at one point. There's really no such thing as enduring selves and bosons, right? Well, we're not the same collection of fermions and bosons now as we were 5 minutes ago. So really just not the same person we were 5 minutes ago. So there's no such thing as enduring selves. We can't explain consciousness in physical processes alone. So hit the delete button on that. There's no such thing as consciousness. It's all an illusion, which, begs the question of who's having this illusion.
Yeah.
So you get, and he's a moral nihilist too, so he's like, look,
in his view, we could all just be part of someone else's computer simulation.
Well, see, even the computer simulation thing is kind of dumb because think about it for a second. I know this is like what Elon Musk subscribes to, and so many of these people who think they're scientific, and Neil deGrasse Tyson, thank you for bringing this up so we could finally drag him into a conversation.
Thank goodness.
He's agnostic or whatever. He always makes fun of a religion, but then he has this quote of like they were at a conference talking about computer simulations, and somebody asked him, what do you think the chances are that we're in a computer simulation? He's like, I think it's highly probable. It's like, first off, simulations, and somebody asked him, what do you think the chances are that we're in a computer simulation? He's like, I think it's highly probable. It's like, what evidence do you have for this at all, right? At all. Elon Musk, I think, says that there's too many coincidences. Well, we would call that God's providence first, right? Number two is, what is a computer? It's a material thing. It's a physical thing. What do we just say consciousness cannot be explained by? Material, physical things.
Right. That's right.
So it's philosophically
it's
incoherent.
It's crazy because we're all just part of a computer simulation. Like, okay, I've run a few simulations in my day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, never once do you have, and very robust simulations, do you think okay, the agents that are moving through the simulation have consciousness or sentience?
Yeah, whenever you're playing,
why would you create a simulation to do that? Again, what's the point of the simulation?
Mm-hmm.
You're running an experiment to yield data, right? I'm going to run as many possibilities or iterations through the simulation, right? You use a computer so you can do many more than you can do by hand.
Yep.
Because your cycle time is faster, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And you get a result. You're not running a simulation just to run the simulation, so these little variables and data structures can talk to each other.
It's so important to understand, when you're starting from the position of a materialist or a physicalist or a metaphysical naturalist, and you understand what matter is on that conception, that it's a disparate collection of unconscious, undirected, unaimed physical bits of stuff, right?
Right.
And then you run into what's called the categorical gap, where somehow, some way, you think that all this stuff gathered together and then flip. And then you run into what's called the categorical gap, where somehow, some way, you think that all this stuff gathered together and then flipped over into its complete qualitative opposite, into something that is unified, directed, teleological, self-aware. You cannot cross that chasm. It is a logical impossibility between the starting point of physicalism, materialism, and consciousness. You cannot. It's like saying, I think the most apt analogy of this is it doesn't matter how many white blocks you have and how much time you have to rearrange them, you're never going to get a black tower out of it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So just saying, oh, well, if we just had enough time and enough complexity, somehow consciousness will emerge. You'll hear this idea of emergence. Just replace in any philosophical or scientific work we hear about emergence theories of consciousness. Replace emergence with the word magic, and you have just as good of an explanation. every single time. It works, but it's not a logical impossibility anymore where it is with material. So like people, and like the reason DeGrasse, and I don't know enough about Musk, so I won't say that, the reason they hop to this ridiculous notion of computer simulations is because, one, they're so anti-religious, they've got such an animism out there, but they know that their worldview by itself is wholly unsatisfying and insufficient, that they're willing to just jump. It's like chess.
Think about the irony of this, right? We're all part of a computer simulation, right? So this computer was designed, maybe even created, by a highly intelligent super being, but not God.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, wait, hold on. So you'll reject any arguments for intelligent design elsewhere, but a computer simulation, which has to be intelligently designed.
That's right.
Like, it makes you want to just throw yourself off a bridge. It's so stupid. So aside from the it makes you want to just throw yourself off a bridge. It's so stupid. So aside from the philosophical problems of saying, like, look, no, it's still like the hard problem of consciousness cannot be run on a computer simulation any more than it can be run on physicalism, materialism.
There's just logical problems.
There's just logical problems. But it's very telling. It's like Chesterton said, one of my favorite writers, like, people who don't believe in God don't believe in nothing. They'll believe in anything. And you see this all the time. All the time. And those are just really good examples of that. And I think last time we talked about, like, well, we'll get back to it. I want to get Aleks in here because there is the one point of the conflict hypothesis that does have certain merit, and that's the idea that what we know, and I want to be fair in this treatment, and I think it's instructive, that certain things we know about the world scientifically do tend to, or can, I shouldn't say do tend to, but can compete truth claims made by certain particular religions at certain times. And we suggested, and we'll suggest here, that this really just comes down to, at least in the most popular cases, inappropriate readings of Scripture. The most famous one, of course, being like young earth creationists, six-day literalist creationists in the book of Genesis. So I will first say that the Catholic tradition obviously does not hold that position, nor has it ever. You go back to Augustine, some 1,500 years before Darwin, or certainly long before modern cosmology, and he said, like, look, guys, we don't need to take this literally, nor should we. God could have released certain potentials into the universe that could have unfurled over any expanse of time. Rather, there's deep theological and spiritual truths that we're supposed to get out of Genesis. We're not trying to create in this in this book an etiological map of cosmology. That wasn't the intention of the author at the time. So, Aleks, what's the Jewish perspective on that?
Well, it's basically that. I mean, I'm not aware of any in particular, but there are some very insular Jewish groups that might hold this idea of the world being created in 6 days. But generally, even the most Orthodox Jews that I've spoken to will readily say, well, yeah, it's not supposed to be taken literally. It's meant to explain some fundamental spiritual truths. And keep in mind, too, that the creation story happens over the course of one chapter. So, I mean, and the chapters are arbitrary. Like, they're not a part of the original text. They were inserted later by the Archbishop of Canterbury in sometime in, I don't know, 15 or 1600s or something like that. But at any rate, the amount of time spent on it is pretty minimal, okay? And again, the reason why is it's a very sweeping story that's meant to be very deep. It's not meant to be very long, very explanatory, and it's certainly not meant to be a science text, right? So I think the issue being that there are, at least nowadays, I don't know if this has always been the case, but there do seem to be nowadays certain religious groups that hold that it's meant to be taken literally, which on its face doesn't even make any sense. Like the idea that it would take 6 24-hour periods, the first of which occurring before the official creation of a full day, it's like, it seems to be pretty clear that it's meant to be, viewed in these are different epochs of time. And it's also not that uncommon in the Bible for, words like this to be used sort of poetically. Like in the book of Daniel talks about there's a prophecy called the 7 weeks, for example. But each week, it means years. So it's 7 weeks of years. So each week, quote unquote, is a period of 7 years, right? But the term week, even though it's being used in the same sense as it normally would for a 7-day period, it's being used poetically. It's being used, to indicate some sort of a prophecy. And it's the same thing, I think, in the book of Hosea. I could be wrong about the book, but there's a prophecy about the ingathering of the exiles and the return of the rebuilding of the third temple, and they're referred to as 3 days. So the first day being, the period of time leading up to the first temple, second day being, between the first and second temples, and then the second temple until the third temple, and so on and so forth. So, but they're referred to as days. These are very clearly not 24-hour periods. So it's not really even that, it's not that uncommon in the Bible. It's not like there's just this one instance where this happens. So again, to me, it seems like it's more people who have very I don't even know that I want to call them fundamentalist beliefs, because there's nothing fundamental about a belief like that. It's like you just elected to believe something like this.
Yeah, and that's true. Fundamentalism in the way that you really do see it, and that I think that the conflict hypothesis is actually valid, isn't fundamental. It's relatively new. Yeah. It's a relatively new cultural emergence. And a lot of it was a response on the Protestant side to modernism. That's really where that comes from. To what extent do I think that can be helpful? Well, I think if you're wading through, because what we're trying to do in this episode is show that there's deep harmony between at least a theistic or supernatural view of the world and the scientific enterprise and reason. But of course, we would all still have specific disagreements on religion. Well, same thing. And this I'll go back to Aquinas, who I think rightfully said, look, reason and faith can never be at odds because they come from the same source, right? If there's a conflict, you're doing something wrong. So if you hold to a religious worldview that is, I would say, fundamental, and that's again part of the reason that drew me to the Catholic Church. One was just interpretation. I'm never going to be able to figure this out myself. There's just no way. I could dedicate my life to it, and I could still be wrong. So it seems like there has to be some type of guiding authority there. But that is where, but the problem, at least in society, is and so much of it is the media, right? Because whenever they want to, bring up a political talking point, they're never getting, the religious scientist or physicist or high-minded fundamentalist to come on, right? They're picking that sort of backwoods fundamentalist who just wants nothing to do with science at all, who does reject science, and they're like, there's religion for you, folks. There it is. And it perpetuates this myth, and it creates this, first off, wholly unnecessary divide, and leads to this conversation.
Well, it's just cherry picking, plain and simple. It's if we took a study, maybe it's the methodology of the study was very sound, but now we know that the conclusions reached in that study to be wrong, right? That's one study out of how many hundreds and thousands of studies that have been done, right? Would we then say, look, science is wrong, we must abandon all of it? No, because that's cherry picking, obviously, right? So religion is different than what any specific religion may say.
Correct.
And it's just, again, it's a case of cherry picking, but on the other side.
Yeah.
How should I say this? The fact that we are religious people means we have to agree that someone is wrong. Right? But that doesn't mean that we're all wrong. One is wrong. Right? But that doesn't mean that we're all wrong. Does that make sense?
It does. Well, so I mean, that's why I say it's supernaturalism versus naturalism, right?
Right.
So, for example, just and this isn't our position, but say I'm a monotheist, Aleks is a polytheist, and you're a pantheist, right? These would
Right.
all kind of fall into a supernaturalist
Yes.
worldview,
Yep.
but we couldn't all be right. And
Correct.
that's the point you're making.
Yes.
And that is the situation, not specifically like that, but we do hold specific views that are different, and we
Right.
can't all be right in that. But what we're arguing in this is for a general supernatural worldview rather than a naturalistic worldview. Let's go back to Genesis for a minute, because there's a few things in there I think are important. Like, what does Genesis actually tell us? What is it conveying? What are these truths we're supposed to hear? Well, I think these actually provide not only a lot of harmony for the scientific worldview, and I also do believe they're true, but there's been some impressive scientific confirmation of these. First off is the fact that man is made in the image and likeness of God, right? Now, what does that tell us? Well, it means that we should expect the world to be intelligible, that we have us. Well, it means that we should expect the world to be intelligible, that we have reason, the capacity to know and grasp truth. This jives perfectly with our experience. Yeah. It also helps us to understand, again, consciousness, things like this. There's, yes, mysteries of how the soul works, all that, and whether it's a trialist, interactionist, or hylomorphic theory. It's definitely not Descartes. But whatever it is, if you can accept a little bit of mystery, not incoherence, but a little bit of mystery, then everything else becomes clear, right? Whereas on the other hand, if you try to make everything clear at the start like a Rosenberg and think you're just a pack of fermions and bosons, then everything becomes confused and distorted and incoherent. And I think that's a really important thing. Okay, we don't quite know how the soul works. I'm prone to obviously the Catholic view, right? That the soul is the form of the body. Explain that. But there's always going to be a certain degree of mystery, especially if we're looking for a scientific investigation of an immaterial aspect of reality. You're not going to get it, because science, by definition, is looking at physical reality. That's the same thing. If you think that you're ever going to find God through a telescope or a microscope, you're just making an enormous category mistake. You just haven't thought about who God is or what God is. So you're just confused on basic concepts. So Genesis is trying to convey that humans are made in the image and likeness of God, that we're possessed of an infinite dignity and value. I mean, there's the basis for everything that we hold dear in Western cultural ethics. Like, where do you think that comes from? That doesn't come from any other culture. It just doesn't. I mean, especially you go back, you look at like Greco-Roman culture, you didn't have that at all. You had some talk of virtues like justice, but compassion was generally looked down upon. They supported all kinds of murder and infanticide and things like that, right? Well, we're going to be owing these societies a lot of apologies pretty soon with the direction that we're going, right? At least we didn't kill our babies, is what we used to say. But like again, that's one thing Genesis is trying to convey. Another thing is this radical doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, right? Creation out of nothing, God over all. The God is the ultimate creator and sustainer of everything in being. Now, that's interesting because for the longest time, everybody laughed at the Judeo-Christian worldview at that, because they just assumed from Aristotle on down the line until Father Georges Lemaitre came around that the universe was just eternal. That was just the basic default position. And then, lo and behold, the strongest evidence we have now shows that some 13.8 billion years ago, the universe just sort of winked into existence out of nothing. That's what the theories, and there are different theories, of the Big Bang tell us. That before this point, it doesn't even, or this boundary, it doesn't even make sense to use the term before, because that's when time started. Now, that smacks of a creation event, if anything does. It certainly does. And of course, there's lots of arguments people have given along those lines. So again, here's a point of where no, it's if you're willing to look at this in a much more nuanced way, there's harmony here. There's concord here. So unless you're willing to think that the physical universe just popped into being out of nothing, which is the height of absurdity, right? There's like if there's anything we know, it's that out of nothing comes and nothing ever will. So and this is again why I think you see people just kind of jumping off into all these unparsimonious extravagances like multiverse theories or computer simulation. Because like we're at this point where it's like, okay, how do we explain this? How do we explain this? And if anybody's interested in exploring the modern cosmology and creation thing, go listen to my episode with Father Spitzer, because he actually he's got his PhD in philosophy of science. He's a physicist, so he knows all about this, and we go through the problems with these ridiculous multiverse theories and so on and so forth. But I think you said, I think some like this is kind of I guess somewhat of like one of those first cause arguments, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important. It's important to understand that there's different types of cosmological arguments in natural theology, and most of them, for the longest time, including the ones that I think are the best, like Aquinas, weren't actually looking at it as God as the being who just kind of flicked down the first domino, right? You can make those types of arguments like the Big Bang, and I think that they're pretty good. But Aquinas and Aristotle and Leibniz and Lonergan and a lot of contemporaries, when they make the cosmological arguments, they're really just starting from basic first principles, again, that all science and philosophy has to assume, and showing just on these principles alone, we can show very definitively that God exists. And I think these are worth it, because everybody gets it wrong. Everyone's like, well, or they'll say something stupid, like, oh, well, you know, if Aquinas says that everything has a cause, therefore the universe has a cause, and it was God. But what caused God? Well, first off, Aquinas never said that everything has a cause. He just never said that. Was never anything he literally ever said. So you get these caricatures of arguments like this that people massively misunderstand. Aquinas simply said this: things exist that don't have to exist, that reality didn't have to include. For example, Aleks. We're all glad that reality included Aleks, and Aleks is glad that reality also included Robitussin. But reality didn't have to include Aleks or Robitussin. He's contingent. He's a caused reality or a conditioned reality. So, for example, everything in this room is a conditioned reality. There's certain conditions that have to be fulfilled for me to exist.
That's right.
Right? My molecular structure, my conditions that have to be fulfilled for me to exist.
That's right.
Right? My molecular structure, my parents meeting, the environment, all of it. So then, like, what Aquinas is doing very brilliantly, right? And he's not making scientific arguments. It's just logical. He just asked the question, okay, well, whatever could all of reality be conditioned? Could all of it, whatever the totality of reality is, could that be conditioned? And the answer is obviously not, because what you're saying that a conditioned reality is a reality that is awaiting existence on the fulfillment of conditions, right? So if all of reality is conditioned, but there's nothing outside of it, which would be a contradiction because we just said it's all of reality, then we're saying that all of reality is a type of thing that is awaiting existence on the fulfillment of conditions that don't exist.
That's right.
Which means that all of reality would not exist at all if it was all conditioned. So what can we conclude from this? And this is as logically airtight as it can get, is that there must be at least some part of implicity to show that it has to be a mind or an unactualized actualizer. It can't be anything physical, because anything in the physical universe, fundamental particles, laws, they all could have been otherwise. They're not included in reality in the strongest sense. And that's what a necessary reality would have to be. It's something that not only has to exist, but could not exist any other way. So anything that could have been older or younger, or over here, or over there, or bigger or small, all those are conditioned. All those are contingent, right? So that's just all of physical reality. Now you can add the scientific evidence on top of it to support it, but you don't need it. You can figure and Aquinas obviously didn't even have it back then. You can figure all this out philosophically, and then you're really kind of left with two options. One is abstract objects, if you think they exist apart from mind at all, like the number 7 or the essential properties of meatloaf. Number 2 is some type apart from mind at all, like the number 7 or the essential properties of meatloaf. Number 2 is some type of unrestricted act of mentation or understanding, a mind. But it can't be abstract objects because they don't cause anything. That's what by definition, abstract objects are causally effete. So even if they did exist independent of minds, that can't be the necessary reality. So you're left with this Aristotle would call it the unmoved mover, Aquinas the unactualized actualizer, Lonergan the unrestricted active understanding, whatever. It's a mind, right? That's the only possible thing it could be. And those are the types of arguments that Aquinas makes. So people are like, oh, they're old. It doesn't matter how old they are, right? They're not they weren't scientific arguments that are subject to revision by scientific data because they work off of principles that science itself has to presuppose. So you can't like refute Aquinas off of scientific data, if that makes sense, which everybody tries to do. They're like, he wasn't a scientist. You just never read or understood Aquinas. You never did the metaphysics. So that's one type of first cause argument, showing that the fact that anything exists at all, which Leibniz said, which Leibniz, by the way, was the co-discoverer of calculus. This guy was about as brilliant as it gets. So he was a mathematician, philosopher. He said, you know, the first and most exquisite question a person should ask is, why is there something rather than nothing? And he developed the same line of argument. So you have all these different thinkers, all these brilliant thinkers, many from different traditions. Aristotle had nothing to do with Christianity at all, but he could show through rational processes alone that there had to exist this foundational level of reality, God. Now, he didn't think of the God in the way that Christians or Jews think of it, but he got us to the God of the philosophers, so to speak. So not only can you know of God's existence very definitively philosophically, but explained by God. And here's where we just have a whole host of things, right? God is the best explanation, for example, of why anything exists instead of nothing. God is the best explanation for why the universe began to exist. It's important to understand those are different. God is the best explanation for the exquisite fine-tuning of the initial constants and quantities of the universe for the emergence of intelligent life, right? Very, very fascinating, and I explored that with Father Spitzer in the 2 episodes with him. God is the best explanation for the existence of consciousness and why it cannot be reduced to physical processes alone. God is the best explanation for us having a transphysical soul. And all these literally thousands of cases now in published medical journals of veridical near-death experiences. Sam and I were talking about this the other day at lunch, where you have cases of even people who are congenitally blind from birth seeing in their near-death experiences and reporting veridical data. Right? There's near-death experiences. Sam and I were talking about this the other day at lunch, where you have cases of even people who are congenitally blind from birth seeing in their near-death experiences and reporting veridical data. Right? There's just no physicalist explanation for that. You can't call it, you know, the dying flickering of a brain or hallucinations, because hallucinations don't produce veridical data. Certainly not in people who are congenitally blind, or terminal lucidity, or the applicability of mathematics. Like the explanatory power, scope, coherence, and consistency of a supernaturalist, and you don't have to commit to any particular religion, at least not yet, worldview, just has deep, and I would argue necessary concord with both reason and science. And if you scrap all that, I think if you scrap theism, supernaturalism, I think you have to go the way of Aleks Rosenberg. And that's why I like this guy. Honestly, I think they're just too cowardly to go. Because the old atheists weren't. Nietzsche was willing to go there. Sartre, you know, the absurdists, the old atheists who were nihilists and absurdists, they were willing to follow it through to its logical end. And now you just kind of have these people who are like, who think that like atheism is just a synonym for I'm more intelligent than you. That's really what it is. And they haven't studied it. They just haven't actually like really thought about it. And they buy into these talking points and these like ridiculous debates between like the backwoods fundamentalist and, you know, whoever, the secular scientists, and they're like, oh yeah, religion is ridiculous, so I don't want to associate with that at all. I don't know. I've been ranting. Somebody else chime in here for a minute.
Perfect timing, because you just hacked your lungs out right as you handed me the microphone. Sam, do you have anything to add?
And I think we touched on this last time, is this idea that, you know, you have 2 brothers starting neutral, and, you know, one brother decides to go into science, and then you have another brother that doesn't, and the brother that doesn't remains a religious person, and the brother that does go into science, through science, comes to a reasoned position to abandon the religious view. I don't think that's really the way it happens. It really seems like the causal direction is the other way around. Is you start off with either an agnostic view or some sort of tribal attachment, and then you also happen to be a scientist, and then you say, look, I'm a scientist, so I must be right about my agnostic or atheist worldview. Right about my agnostic or atheist worldview. So that I think is a fundamental piece of where people are getting the conflict from. They're not arriving at the conflict by really following this through all the way down. They're starting with the conflict and rationalizing it with some rudimentary science or quote unquote belief in science that they have. Because a lot of these people aren't even really scientists. Yeah.
It's a very good point.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
And yeah, I guess what are some of the other conflicts? 'Cause I want to make sure we're very thorough on this episode.
Oh yes.
Just don't like to leave the job half done. Well, evolution always gets brought up, but here's the thing: if all the other arguments that the job half done, well, evolution always gets brought up, but here's the thing: if all the other arguments that you think we presented so far have any force whatsoever, it just doesn't matter. It really doesn't. There's nothing about evolutionary theory that can say anything one way or other about God. The only way it does is if you put on a philosophical gloss or metaphysical add-on, which so many people do.
Yeah. So, like evolution specifically, like let's say like the neo-Darwinistic theory of evolution is 100% correct.
Yep.
Right. Great. Does nothing to take down what you just said about the existence of God, right?
Not at all.
But if it turns out that it's wrong, it does further bolster the existence of God.
Which is a very salient point. So the the first thing I want to say is like, if you are a religious person, you can and should be completely open to the evidence of evolution. It just isn't a conflict at all.
Right.
It just is. You just like you don't need to be perturbed by it at all,
right,
on any level. You really don't. So it's just neither here nor there. And the fact that people keep wanting to make it a conflict is just because they want a conflict when there doesn't need to be one. But what Sam said is very interesting. Is for people who aren't religious, if there is a problem with the theory, and there's recently there's something going around, this whole descent from Darwinism, of over 1,000 scientists, some of them from the most prominent institutions, who just have come out and supported the very modest claim that they don't believe that selection and mutation can really account for the complexity of life. So stronger criticism lately, especially as new discoveries are being made in molecular biology or this or that. And you often see any sort of dissent or criticism of evolution met with absolute venom. And I have an unsupported hypothesis on what this is. And that is that if it turns out that the neo-Darwinian theory is wrong, or that there's something really wrong with evolutionary theory, I mean, what else do you have? That's kind of it if you're a naturalist. Like where it's really the only game in town. So it has to be true. And in that sense, that's kind of unfortunate, isn't it? Because you, like, as a religious person, again, I think you can and should be open to the evidence. It just doesn't matter one way or another. But if you're not, I don't know. And I think that's why when people feel like their backs are against the wall or they're in the corner, I think that explains why this debate has gotten so, especially, and that's why I typically don't even like to talk about the evolution, because it's just so upset people get over this. And I get it's got a pretty tangled history, but it isn't a problem and doesn't need to be a problem, especially not for a religious person. Is it a problem if you're a naturalist? It might be. It might be, because it might really be the only game in town. But I don't have a lot of patience for it, because again, like if you want to make a design argument, that argument is is the teleologic argument is with the fine-tuning of the universe, right? If the design argument goes there, or even with the fact of how do you explain the teleology of, say, the attraction of protons and electrons, right, for example. Like, these all precede evolution. Like, they're more fundamental to it. So that's where the design arguments really are. And then if there's further ones, like, so be it. Doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. So you can kind of do like an end run around the whole muddy waters of the evolutionary debate that you can but it's always the point, but it's like the least salient or the least pertinent to the conversation ultimately. Again, I think that it's a legit conflict for people who might hold a young earth creationist. Sure, that's fine. That I could understand why that particular view would have trouble with it. Certainly not something that the Catholic Church says, hey, whatever. The only thing that evolution can't say is that the soul evolved, which it hasn't. It hasn't, right? That every soul is the unique individual creation by God. Now, however else God wanted to bring about life, that's his prerogative. It really doesn't matter. So that's pretty much it. The whole point, right? So not only is there not a conflict between faith and reason, or science and reason, science and religion, but there is when you actually take science and religion, but there is when you actually take a sophisticated and nuanced look at this, you realize that there's deep harmony, deep concord between the two, between the universe actually being intelligible, our ability to understand, to comprehend, the fact that we are conscious and self-aware. I mean, what a like crazy thing to even think about when you even just think about consciousness. Like the fact that we are aware that we're aware, and that we can be aware of the fact that we're aware that we're aware. Like, how does that even work? It's crazy. It's like you're doubling back on yourself, right? It's nuts when you think about it, but that's okay. Any concluding thoughts here, gentlemen? So I'm scratching the beard. We got to do a theology podcast too, where we just go around the room and just yell. We don't have to in the room and just yell. We don't have to make it a debate. We just be like, here is the worldview according to Catholicism. Here's the worldview according to conservative Judaism. Here's the worldview. Sam's Hindu. When Hindu is a collection of religions. So, what is the name? What is your?
No, I mean we're Hindus are Hindus. Mm-hmm. There's just I don't know how to explain it.
But I know enough. Like some Hindus are polytheists, other Hindus are pantheists, and some Hindus are monotheists. However. And or some are like kind of a blend in some ways, correct?
Well, maybe some of them are wrong.
It's okay.
So what I would say, the proper view of Hinduism is that it is a monotheistic religion. Mm-hmm. Sort of the different aspects. So the Hindus and the Hindu sages realized that the nature of God is too complex for us to understand. Mm-hmm. So let us divide it into these different aspects of the universe and that life to describe them. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is.
And then that just you would probably say devolved into a polytheistic.
Yeah, so that's the like Hinduism is essentially polytheistic in practice, but monotheistic in belief.
In principle.
In principle, yeah.
Excellent.
So like we have however many people say like 300 million different deities.
Impressive.
Right. But those deities are all, how should I say this? The deities are not God. Mm-hmm. They are just a sliver of one aspect of what God is.
That makes sense.
That's it.
Yeah, good.
So depending on what you're praying for, you pray to a different deity.
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah.
Good. So we will, that's where we'll pick it up next time. We'll actually go around the room and we'll just do a theology cast. So, folks, hopefully you found this episode to be helpful. It's one of those topics that I find especially annoying, especially and that's how it started. Aleks brought up this line, and I'm like, oh man, we got to do a podcast on that. That's too rich. So if you enjoyed it, please subscribe. Please share with both.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.